we did this trip to Disney World, and on this trip, I have this moment. We're 3 or 4 days into this trip, and I'm like, here I am in the supposedly happiest place on earth, and honestly, I'm not very happy. Like I'm melancholy. I'm not feeling very good, and so that kind of opened the door for me to start thinking about some of this internal world kind of stuff. And around that time, experienced my first diagnosis with depression. And so started seeing a counselor through that. Just speaking of adult children of alcoholics, but research is showing that of the current adults in our country, 1 in 5 grew up in a home with an alcoholic, either parent or relative. And so you're talking about a high number of people who have experienced this kind of dysfunction. There are sins that we commit out of rebellion against God, just a desire to disobey and go against his leading. But there's also things that we do and sins that we commit out of the pain that others have inflicted on us. And then it's not so much about our disobedience against God, but we are reacting from a place of our own pain.
Just because I don't believe or agree doesn't mean I can't learn from you.
Why did you have to bring that up?
Okay, that one I'm super embarrassed about. Do you like me?
Do I like you?
Yeah.
As an individual or as a podcast?
As a person.
No, I like you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I don't have any interest in appearing to be stronger than I am.
I ain't bow to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. He gonna leave. You feel me?
How do we love people who see the world differently than we do?
What would it look like if we truly loved all of our neighbors? Could listening to their stories be the first step? This is Seacoast Church, and there's way more to talk about.
All right, well, welcome to the Seacoast podcast. What are y'all laughing at?
You just kind of
now our listeners have no idea what y'all are laughing at. Explain yourself.
And they never will.
We can't explain ourselves.
Do you want me to?
We just had a conversation that cannot be aired, and I think that's what, because we just made that quick transition.
Mm-hmm. We were just sharing some stories that,
Deep,
would get us all fired.
Stay here at the table.
Not we.
Yeah, not we.
Joey.
Lynne.
Yeah, we stayed clean.
No, Joey would get fired. I would just have a talk with HR.
Well, we've got Pastor Ike Miller coming on here in a second, talking about his newly released book. So people are in for a treat. But I wanted to tell Jack, every time I sit down and put some notes together, and I know that you're coming in, one of my first thoughts is, how can I mess with Jack?
Oh, man. Okay.
Amy, do you like that question too?
Yes, let's see. Let's go.
Right. So I've got 3 questions that I picked purposely because I think you'll hate.
Ooh.
Okay.
All right. First question, what gives you a warm fuzzy?
Oh. Okay.
Like your kids hugging your neck and saying, I love you, Dad? Does that give you a warm fuzzy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay. Why don't you ever wear...
That's nice.
Why don't you ever wear shorts?
Ooh.
Oh. Well, okay. So first of all, I wear shorts to work out. I don't work out in business wear.
Okay.
Okay, that's good.
But no,
But you don't wear it leisurely or recreationally. Well, I guess recreationally.
Around the
seen you in
house.
shorts.
If it's somewhere around the house, yeah, I wear shorts. But
Okay.
no, and I don't wear shorts out.
Just geeky?
No, because I'm not a child. And I just think that,
Okay.
I just think that
shorts are for children.
Yes.
Answer ever.
For men,
I'm not a
yes.
child.
So for men, my is shorts in public are for children. That's just how I feel. See now, I can never wear shorts anywhere ever again because we're like, hey man, what about
You're a child.
what if your kid?
Hey, I love this because his dad, by the way, we've talked to his dad about him and we've talked to him about his dad. We're getting them both, and you and I get to be a part of that.
I've never met your dad.
So
I need to.
I love the fact that his dad has actually said this statement before. He said, I just don't understand the whole hat thing at work. I was like, wow, this has got to be kind of a tricky place for you to work at Seacoast because it ain't just hats, you know?
Right.
And not even at work, in worship,
on stage and all of that stuff.
Oh, this is going to be the best.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
All right. So I lied. This one's a serious one. Will you explain the most significant advancements in the church from 500 to 1000 AD and compare it to 1000 to 1500 AD? But we need to move on, so make it quick.
No.
Amy's already checked out.
I'm already over here. I'm thinking
carols over here.
See, usually if Jack was new to the podcast, he would have gotten excited just now, but he knows we just wanted to make fun of him.
Yeah.
So you opting out?
Not even you use this "we" word a lot.
Not even just not new to the podcast, not new to you.
All right, so I am very much so looking forward to a follow-up conversation that we had on Halloween about horror movies because Lynne, I'm even wondering if Lynn's going to be able to keep her composure. So reminders for people, maybe this is the first episode they're listening to. You're the number one fan. You're a part of the podcast, but you're also like the biggest fan. You love it. All right. So this was the first time. Would you say this was the first time that what people were saying was offensive? Like, was it offensive to you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, Joey.
And would you break this down as a matter of morals? Like we're talking right and wrong right now.
Some of it was. And some of it, there was one part of the conversation that I felt like did not line up with the word of God.
Oh.
And so, do
you remember what part that was?
Yeah.
You know,
say it.
So there was a conversation about like, can watching horror movies be beneficial? And there was a conversation around how seeing horror movies gives you knowledge about the spiritual realm, and that could be helpful for you. And I'm like, that's just not good theology. And so I'm like, that is the very definition of using weapons of this world, and our weapons are not of this world. And so even the idea that watching horror would help you deal with the spiritual realm is an idea that sets itself up against the knowledge of Christ. And so that was one thing that I was like, I was driving in my car and I was like, what? And I was like, Joey.
That was me, right? Didn't I say something along those lines?
I don't know if it was you or not.
We don't need to name names.
Kind of discussing it, and no one refuted it.
Right.
And I felt very strong. And you know me, there are not a lot of hills I'll die on, but this is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Of like, I was like, that is not, like, no.
Yeah.
Like, no.
No, ma'am.
So I think I agreed with that statement. And what I linked it to, I want to say I used the example of the conversation you and I had about movies that portrayed early America, slavery and all of that, and how those flicks, not only do I enjoy history, but they have been helpful for me to actually see the horror of slavery, because you can hear about it and then you can actually see, oh my gosh, this was insanely awful. And I think that's where we kind of linked that to same concept in the spiritual realm sort of thing. So,
and I would say I did hear one person say something that was different than that. And so on that point, I just disagree with you on that. Like, I feel like we don't have to see horror to have empathy and understand it, right? Like, before I ever saw, and I think you guys talked about the Passion of the Christ, I had never seen that. But when I came to the Lord and I read scripture, like the weight of what Jesus did, like I can feel that and like feel the pain of it and the horror of it without having a visual image for it, which the church has been doing for thousands of years before we ever had television. And so even, and the same with documentaries, like I don't, like the spirit of the living God is in us. And so I think compassion and empathy and like understanding for something that happened that we didn't see, we can have that without beholding it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Even does it give you a different angle, given that the writers and the producers, writers, whatever you call it, for The Conjuring are actually Christians?
No.
Nope. Does it give it a different angle that when good conquers evil in horror movies?
No.
All right. What do y'all think about? Did y'all listen? Y'all don't have to. It's okay.
I actually listened to it twice.
Twice?
Yeah.
Why?
Because I forgot when you resent it. I was like, oh, let me refresh myself.
Oh, gotcha. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. What are your thoughts on all this, Amy?
Oh, so you told them that we were having this conversation today?
Yeah, I did.
Did you tell me?
No, because I knew you already listened. Should I have told you? You don't like to know.
No.
No, you don't like to know.
Good.
I want to know y'all's thoughts.
the thoughts just
Just
on
in general,
movies?
horror movies, what Lynn's saying.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and because I used to watch all that stuff growing up, and it's like I didn't think it affected me. I just thought it like washed over me. Like a lot of the movies y'all were talking about, I watched, with Pennywise the Clown. I used to like terrorize my younger sister. I thought it was funny, and it didn't really affect me. And then when Lee and I got married, we would watch it. We had friends that watched it. There was like one I still remember, From Hell. Have you ever seen that one?
From Hell?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-mm.
And it was terrible. It was like this.
It's a terrible movie or terribly disturbing?
Disturbing. Like I had terrible nightmares. And there was another one after that. And I remember it was like we just started realizing that we were dealing with fear and we didn't know what it was from. And we just realized we were like, by watching those, because we would do it with like friends and often, and we're like, it's stemming from that. Like we're kind of letting that in and we just stopped. So horror movies, no. So we can do thrillers or, like, I don't know. Do you call it thrillers?
Thrillers is like the bad guy is around killing people and they got to be stopped sort of thing.
Yeah, something like that. But like we don't do any type of demonic or anything like that presence.
But I would imagine that the thrillers could exceed what you guys would be comfortable with when it comes to violence and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so sometimes and where we will fast forward or we'll have to be like, oh, I didn't need to see that. But yeah, we kind of had to be like, just on our thing, we're not going to let that in. We just chose because it affected us. And I didn't realize that it did, but it did. So
And you mentioned Passion of Christ. I don't think we brought that up. And I was going to ask you when it comes to the terminology, and I would highly encourage you to listen to that episode if this is striking a chord with anybody. We'll have it in the show notes, but we used the terminology and we explained it clearly that this had nothing to do with the stereotypical sexual pornography, but we used the terminology torture porn.
I don't like it.
I don't like the term.
I don't like the term
either. Can we just say something else?
Sure. Jack?
Pull out one of your words.
Well, no, I actually don't mind the term because I think that what it says, like it's actually, to my mind, says exactly what it is, which is it's not for any other deeper meaning than you enjoy watching people suffer. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think it's a helpful term is because that's not a great thing, to simply enjoy watching other people suffer. So I do not watch horror movies, will not. And it's not a principled thing. I really don't like seeing normal people get killed.
Yeah.
Look, I like thriller. It's not violence itself. Like there are plenty of movies I enjoy. Like, look, I really enjoy the John Wick movies. Like they're just mindless and stupid and and really fun to watch.
Yeah, I would argue if you were arguing on principle, that's where I'd push back. Like John Wick.
No, it's purely there's something in my brain that like I really can't deal with watching just like normal people get hurt.
Yeah.
It just bothers me a lot. So like I cannot watch horror movies at all. They like I will not nightmares. I just will not be able to not think about them like for a week. So they'll just bother me profoundly. So, with the whole like spiritual component of it, I just like they're useful. It's like, of what? It's kind of like when people think that screw tape letters are actually like, like we can learn about what the enemy does. It's like, no, not really. It's a novel that a guy wrote.
Entertainment.
It's good, but it's not actually like if you read screw tape letters and you think you're actually getting like an inside look at how hell works. It's like it's not. That's a weird perspective to have. It's helpful, but you don't need to make it more than it is. And I just think like I don't know. I don't know. I think there's a benefit to watching horror movies. Like, no, there's not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's movies don't all have to be helpful in some way to be enjoyed. So you don't need to find some kind of principle to justify your hobby.
So you would be okay with someone saying, I watch horror movies as a hobby because I enjoy them. You'd be like, okay, to each his own.
Yeah, in a sense, because it's like, there are certainly movies that I like that are violent or, have things that would bother other people.
Mm-hmm.
If so, there are people who, I think you said, like, there are people who watch horror movies and think they're funny. Like, there's like, they think it's hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
And my thing is like, that, I get that in the way of like, there are some people who's like, it's not real. and I totally understand that it's not real, and so it's just ridiculous to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not really interested in policing entertainment to that degree.
Mm-hmm.
And like think about it like this, like and obviously there are lines, like Passion of the Christ, I think is an interesting example. So obviously we have a written account of Jesus's torture and death. And there have been, there are crucifixes that, and actually that's interesting, for a long time, the crucifixes that showed the suffering Christ were not they weren't acceptable. They didn't show up for several hundred years. For the first several hundred years of the church, the only images of Christ were like Christ victorious. And you didn't see the suffering Christ until later. And that was really controversial at first, and people didn't like it. But, we are okay with depictions of Christ's suffering. And the Passion, okay, now, like the movie, okay, is that too explicit? Is that too much? And some people would say, yes, that's too much. I don't want to see all that. I don't need to see all that. And some people would say, no, that's fine. It's still okay. But at some point, there is a line, right? Like, and this is ridiculous, but obviously, that's kind of my point is, you wouldn't actually torture and crucify a real person and say, now we can understand what Jesus went through because we've actually tortured and killed a real person. So there's a line somewhere in terms of in accessing and, kind of understanding what Jesus went through. There's a line somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing is that line is going to be different for different people.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's fine. I think that's fine in entertainment to acknowledge that we aren't all bothered by the same things in the same way as, there are people who cannot ever touch a drop of alcohol just because of what they know about themselves. And I think that there are people who can.
Yeah.
Right? So I think entertainment, like with everything, everyone is different, and everyone needs to be very aware of who they are and what those lines are for them. And they also need to be aware of, we like to cross our own lines.
Right.
And, there are probably movies that I enjoy that probably shouldn't have watched.
Yeah.
So.
And Lynne, when you brought up Passion of the Christ, you would say that was excessive? No need to show all that?
I mean, my point is that for me, I felt like I've understood that without having to see it.
Yeah.
And so even in that whole conversation of what are we beholding? Mm-hmm. And I think even because the episode was, should Christians watch horror movies? The question was never posed because a lot of the discussion was around, does this affect me? Does it not? Do I think it's funny? Does it create fear? But there was never a question of is this pleasing to the Lord? And so, so the answers were all based on personal preference or experience and not, is Lynne sitting down and in whatever entertainment she's consuming, is she saying, is this horror movie pleasing to the Lord?
Right.
Is this romantic comedy pleasing to the Lord? Because that's the answer of whether you should do it. It's not whether it affects you or whether you're entertained by it.
That's
because
true.
We are entertained by a lot of things that don't please the Lord. And so I think that's where the conversation, it wasn't just a conversation about horror movies and whether you like them. It was a conversation about whether Christians should watch horror movies and what Christ thinks about it was not addressed, which doesn't answer the question.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Hey, I'll close with this story. The number one thing that's ever freaked me out that I saw on TV. So, and I remember we had just gone to watch, so basically a singing Christian band called the Imperials. Have y'all heard of them? Old school, man, old school. So, Sandy Patty and
oh yeah, I know Sandy Patty.
All of those folks. Yeah, Twyla Paris, Margaret Becker, Matthew Ward. Should I keep going?
No.
Oh, Ray
Ray Boltz. Shaking her head the whole
time. Boltz.
Go ahead.
Do you remember Ray Boltz?
Let's keep moving.
So we get home from watching the Imperials,
There
and
we
then
go.
we watch one of those 2020 shows, and it's real exorcisms.
Ooh.
And so possibly a mishap on my parents' part for allowing me to see it. I was in the 7th grade, and it's real. I mean, you could question whether or not it was real, but it very much so seemed to be legit footage of a priest, trying to exorcise demons. And that thing scared me for so long. And here's what's crazy. there's a lot of things as an adult I can reflect back on my childhood and give a pretty definitive guess whether or not something happened and I perceived it correctly. Like as an adult, I'm like, there's no way I really saw that or whatever. To this day, I am so not sure. But that night, I slept in my parents' room on the floor, and it was like the temperature outside was perfect for the windows to be up. And I swear, as a kid, I thought for sure there were demons messing with me from outside of the window.
Lord.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
And to this day, I don't know.
Wow.
Jack went to laughter. He's laughing at Joey Svensson.
So hold on. So you're a group of demons clocking in for work, and you're like, all right, what do we have today? It's all right. There's a 6-year-old. And we just need you to give seven.
It's worse. 12 years.
6-year-old.
There's this 12-year-old. We need you to go give him a bad night's sleep.
Let's go mess with them, guys.
This is what we rebelled against the creator of all things for. Okay. All right. That's what we do now. That's what we do. We mess with 12-year-olds as demons. Like that was their job that night. That's why I'm laughing. It's like how mad were they to get that job? Yeah, like how mad would they have been to get that job? We're gonna go bother a 12-year-old.
Well, what if there was so much Holy Spirit in our house, their efforts were thwarted, and they wanted me to do something bad.
To be fair, they weren't thwarted because you were in your 40s and you remember it like it was yesterday.
Yeah,
which like we're laughing about it, but like. That's fear.
Yeah.
And it may not have been a demon, but it was a thought in your head that was not taken captive. And you had fear and you remember it to this day. And so that's why, like, whether it's beholding a real exorcism on TV or like a horror movie, it's like you have to ask, like, is this profitable? Like, what is the benefit of me watching this? Because what effect did it have? You slept on your parents' floor that night because you were scared and you had more fear because you thought you saw something outside.
Right.
And so fear was in a stronghold in your mind that night. Yeah. So, I don't know. To make to end Jack's laughter.
Listen, that's usually the best way to end my laughter. So, like, actually, Jack, you're an idiot.
All right, guys. Well, it's Ike Miller. And I'm telling you, this is a good one, especially for people who have had tumultuous childhoods to grow out of and to learn from and to grow from. And so it's a doozy.
Good.
It's good.
Awesome.
I'm excited.
So when Christine Kane backs your book, that's a good thing, man.
It's a big deal.
That's a good thing.
No, it's really, really kind of her, really generous. We have gotten to know her a little bit through different kind of run-ins at different places. And, I know that Christine had a difficult childhood. She shares about that in some of her books and some of her speaking. And so I just felt like, this was somebody who understood the message of the book, who understood the importance of finding redemption from that. And so it meant the world that she would, take the time to read it.
That's cool.
Give an endorsement.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So how much do you go into your actual family background and the dysfunctions and all of that, and however sort of snapshot you want to give us just for context in this conversation, like what kind of family did you grow up in?
Yeah. So in the book, I don't go into a ton of depth in terms of like sharing a ton of stories. I mean, it's a fair amount. It's funny. I think when people read it, it probably feels more exposing than I feel like it is, just because I've kind of been sharing this for a long time. But I share that I grew up in a context where my father had an alcohol use disorder or alcoholism. And that was from really as early as I can remember. And that led to all kinds of chaos in our home. My parents ultimately divorced. It led to, there was verbal abuse, some physical abuse. And so I share about those things in the book, not so much from the standpoint of like, here's what I went through, but more, let me tell you kind of the environment so that I can help you understand why I'm saying what I'm saying about its impact on us as adults. And so my parents were, had a chaotic relationship. They separated when I was in middle school, and then my father developed prostate cancer around that time. And so they kind of got back together. My mom saw this as a second chance. He had treatment and then seemed to be heading in the right direction, and then went back to drinking, and ultimately was driving with us in the vehicle. And my mom just felt like, I can't do this anymore. This isn't, at this point, it's putting my kids in danger. And so they separated and then ultimately divorced when I was a senior in high school. And so I share, that kind of stuff in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How much of your relationship with is your dad still alive?
No. So my father actually passed away in 2007. So,
okay.
Yeah.
How much of your relationship with your dad was maintained, through him passing, like up until that point? Did you guys manage to salvage a relationship?
Right. So, my parents separated and then divorced at the end of high school. I still wanted to preserve some kind of relationship sort of between me and him. And I wrote him a letter kind of in college, just kind of laying out kind of how I felt about what I had experienced growing up and my understanding of their relationship. And we had a conversation about that. It was certainly one of those things where I think he felt like there's two sides to the story, all of that kind of stuff, which is valid and understandable. And I think after that, we really worked to develop more of a relationship. He would come and visit me in college and we would get meals together and that kind of thing. And so I think that there was a desire there and we were working in that direction. But it was never a super in-depth, kind of relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. My wife is currently working through the very deal of her dad driving drunk with her and her little sister. And, my wife is just on constant, what do I do? How do I protect my kid's sister here? And just, that stuff is still impacting her and working through, which is exactly what we're talking about. I mean, there's so many things I want to try to dive into. And I mean, what are some of the habits and mindsets and that you needed to let go of? And I'm curious, was there ever an aha moment in your life where you're like, oh my gosh, this is impacting me as an adult and I didn't even realize it, maybe to where even Sharon could see stuff long before you?
Yeah, the funny story is I joke that when I was in my early 20s, I was really passionate about relationships. I was somebody that people would go to for advice on relationships. And so I kind of took from that, I don't have any baggage. I've worked through all my stuff. Like I'm a master of relationships. And, I share in the book a little bit about how I came to realization that just wasn't true. But, in the mid 2010s, I don't know what year it was, but I came across this book called Adult Children of Alcoholics. And a part of this book is laying out 12 common characteristics of adult children of alcoholics. And as I'm reading this book and listing these characteristics, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is me. And not only is this me, like I thought everybody was this way and they're not. And so that was a really big moment of, okay, what are other ways that this has shaped me? How is this impacting my relationships? And so I started to do a little bit of that work. But honestly, the big moment for me in terms of just coming to grips with its impact on me in very real ways was during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, leading a church through the pandemic, I mean, anybody that was in a position of leadership where you were making decisions for other people around masking policy, meeting in person, all of those kinds of things, it didn't matter what decision you made, somebody was going to be upset with you. And over the months and months of that happening, I just found myself more and more emotionally exhausted by that. Yep. And I reached a point in August of 2020 where I just took a month off and needed to work through, why was this so hard? Why was the criticism so hard? Why was people disagreeing with me so hard? And I went back to some of this stuff around being an adult child of an alcoholic or dysfunctional family. And I was reading in particular about codependency. And as I was reading about codependency, one of the things they said is in codependency, you try to use your words and actions to manage someone else's emotions and reactions. And I realized, man, that's what I've been doing with my whole church. is I've been trying to use my words and actions to manage someone else's emotions and reactions. And you can't do that with one person, much less a congregation.
What did that look like as far as you trying to do that for your congregation? That's so interesting. Like,
yeah.
How does that play out? Just an example.
Yeah. So let me back up kind of where that, how that's formed, and then we'll go into that.
For sure.
Growing up in a context, and this is true not just with an alcoholic parent. This is true of, an emotionally unhealthy parent. This could be true of a parent with a mental illness, overly critical parents. But a part of my experience was I would go into a room, for example, and I would be assessing, how is my dad feeling? What kind of mood is he in? Where's he at emotionally? Has he been drinking? And not even intentionally thinking that, but you just default to, how do I make sure he's happy? How do I manage his emotions? How do I manage his reactions to me? How do I make sure I'm receiving love and not, abuse of some sort? And you kind of begin to develop that tendency with every relationship then of, how do I use my behavior and my words to ensure that others are happy with me and content with me, because that's how I know I'm safe. So you take that and put that in the context of a congregation, and especially a season like the pandemic where it's so easy for people to be upset with you. And so you're using the decisions that you make, or trying to make decisions that are going to keep people happy with you, because that's how you feel safe, or people will be approving of my decisions so that I will feel good about myself. And so really that's what that looked like during that season, was finding my security in, are people happy with the decisions I'm making?
Gotcha. Golly, man. How about a Christianese term of divine appointment, man? You're talking about this, and I just keep thinking about my wife, man. Like just so similar. Like, do you also experience having to make sure, and I'm not assuming that y'all's journeys are exactly the same or by any means, but do you ever find yourself wanting to make sure everyone around you is happy and safe also? Because it's just like, I've got to make sure, because it's on me to make sure that the people I love are okay and safe.
Yes.
And if they're upset, I've got to figure it out.
That's right. Yeah. So I've got a chapter in the book called, I kind of talk about these 3 questions that we constantly ask coming out of these kinds of environments. One is anything ever really okay? The second one is, what is a normal relationship anyway? And then, can anything good come out of what I've been through? But that question of, is anything really ever okay, is kind of coming out of my own experience of realizing I feel this constant pressure to make sure everything's okay. And that is not just something that happens, but it feels like even when things are okay, they're only okay because I've worked so hard to keep them okay. And if I stop working so hard to keep them okay, everything will fall apart. And, it's funny when you think about the pastoral context, I think there is a way in which that gets labeled as narcissism. Kind of this sense of like, I have to be in control of all of it. And I realized even for myself as a pastor, that doesn't come from a place of like, this is all about me, but ultimately I feel this level of responsibility to make sure everything goes okay. And it can lead to this place of, I'm in control of it all. But it comes more from that place of, no, I've got to make sure it's okay. I've got to make sure I'm responsible for that. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So 2020, when, like, now reflecting back, when do you feel like you really started to take this approach of, okay, I've got to dig deep here.
Yeah.
Like, I can't keep doing this. Like, what did that look like to begin that process of healing?
Yeah. So when I realized that around the codependency, I began looking at what are the other ways that this is impacting, and in particular, my leadership. That's really where this started, was what are other ways in which my childhood is inhibiting my leadership as a pastor.
And you had been a pastor for how long at this point?
So we had planted in 2018. So this was about 2 years into the plant. I'd been a student pastor before that, a youth pastor before that. But in terms of leading our church, we were about 2 years in. Yeah. And I began to realize that a part of my anxiety also came from being a child that grew up in a chaotic environment, as I said earlier, I would go into rooms and assess kind of the emotional climate of a room. And I would read body language and facial expressions and try to discern, okay, is it safe to be here? Are they happy with me? And I realized that I did the same thing now in ministry, where I would go into a room, say on a Sunday morning, and I would be looking at people's faces, their body language, their language towards me, and discerning, okay, are they happy with me? Are they upset? If they're upset, what do I need to do to fix it? And I realized I was just taking responsibility for everybody's emotional worlds. And as I was walking through this, my counselor said to me one day, she goes, Ike, no offense, you're just not that important. And
that's a good therapist right there to break that down to you.
You know, her point was like, there's 1,000 reasons why somebody may be upset on a Sunday morning, or they may have a like downcast look on their face that has nothing to do with you.
Right.
And so,
because then you have some people like me who have what my lead pastor affectionately refers to as an RBF, where I'm actually happy with you, but it looks like I hate you.
I'm constantly mad at you. I hate you. You are the worst. Those are the ones that are so hard for me, because you're like, I feel like I'm like made you angry every day. And so realizing, okay, I'm not responsible for everyone's like bad feelings. If anybody's feeling bad, it doesn't mean I'm instantly responsible or I caused that. At the same time, what I began to do though is begin to say, okay, yes, I'm not responsible for everyone's emotional worlds, but if I can leverage this ability to read people's emotions and read their body language, that can actually help my relationships, because it can give me an insight into where is this person and how do I enter into where they are in a way that communicates love and trust and care, and allows them to be vulnerable with me. And so that was a little bit of where I started that turn towards the idea that some of these things can help us for good, but it demanded doing some of that work around the negative impacts. Another one is along those lines of feeling responsible for everything. You know, it's interesting. People who grew up in these contexts respond in sometimes polar opposite ways, where some people respond just incredibly responsible. They feel responsible for everything. And then other people just respond with incredible irresponsibility. And I wrestled with, why is that? Like, how do you have such drastically different responses from the same household even? And what I came to understand was what happens is people either learn to internalize the pain around them or externalize the pain around them. Internalize meaning they assume that the problems going on around them are because of something wrong in me. And so if I can fix what's wrong with me, then I can fix everything around me. For those who externalize, they would say, well, the reason things are not okay is because of everybody else around me. And if they would get their junk together, then everything would be okay with me. And so that helped make sense of that. But as a pastor who internalized, this led to extreme anxiety. Just because I took responsibility for everything, even if it wasn't mine to fix, even if it was impossible for me to fix, I still felt like it was my responsibility to fix. And so
you
I
probably felt admirable. Did you think you felt admirable to have that too? I mean, because I can imagine. I mean, I've felt the same way. It's just like, well, I'm a pastor. This is an admirable approach to take.
Yeah, exactly. But it leads to anxiety. It leads to perfectionism, right? It leads to unrealistic expectations of ourselves. And so again, that was one of the things where I was burning out as a pastor because I assumed responsibility for everything. And those were a few of the ways that it really started to show up for me.
Yeah. So at that point I love that, reading into your book, it says that it's an intersection of faith, theology, and mental health. Up until this point, had you a lot of experience with a therapist? You had already mentioned your therapist.
Yeah.
Did you already have a relationship with a therapist, or was this something that kind of arose from this sort of self-discovery?
So there's a couple pieces to that. I joked earlier that it was really when I got married that I began to realize that I had some of this baggage. And it started when Sharon and we were a couple months into being married, and she loves Disney. She loves Disney World. And so she was like, if you're going to be married to me, you need to understand my love for Disney. And so we did this trip to Disney World. And on this trip, I have this moment. We're 3 or 4 days into this trip, and I'm like, here I am in the supposedly happiest place on earth. And honestly, I'm not very happy. Like I'm melancholy. I'm not feeling very good. And so that kind of opened the door for me to start thinking about some of this internal world kind of stuff. And so that was 2009. And around that time experienced my first diagnosis with depression. And so started seeing a counselor through that. But also one of the things that I had decided, and Sharon and I had decided that we wanted for our relationship, was actually early in our marriage to start meeting with a marriage counselor on a regular basis. And the reason for doing that was not because we had major problems, but as we like to say, because we didn't want major problems. We wanted to deal with things kind of while they were still small, while they were new. And I'd also seen just the way that marriage counseling had been almost like a last ditch kind of thing on the way to divorce, where it's like, well, we said we tried it, but by that point, the relationship is already at such a point of deterioration, and the love that's demanded for healing relationship feels so lost that it's really hard for counseling work to be effective sometimes. And so we actually started meeting with a counselor in 2010 on a monthly basis that we've continued to meet with now. And so, have been very familiar with that world, been doing a lot of that work for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so happy that it seems as if more and more people are starting to recognize just how important it is. And I'm curious, just as you have pondered this personally, I wonder how many people never do what you wrote about. And so in other words, they never either had the self-discovery, or they never faced it, or they just didn't have the tools to know how to address it. And that kind of stuff haunts me, to think of people who live their whole lives where there is help, there is a way out, there is therapy, there is God, there is community that can bring you out, and it just never happens. I wonder, just your opinion, how often do you think that is? Like how many people do you think just never find healing?
One of the things that I looked into when I was kind of preparing to write this book was thinking through who would this book serve? That's what I really want, is for it to be helpful. And just speaking of adult children of alcoholics, I'm not talking about all of the different kinds of dysfunction. And this book is for more than just people who grew up in an alcoholic context. But research is showing that of the current adults in our country, 1 in 5 grew up in a home with an alcoholic, either parent or relative. Wow. And so you're talking about a high number of people who have experienced this kind of dysfunction.
And that's in America? Was that an American stat? Okay.
Yeah.
So 20% of all of us.
20% of all of us. Yeah. And so, I think it's so prevalent, and part of it's because I think we'd never do this work because there's several reasons. One reason is it just feels too painful to bring it back up. I just would rather leave it in the past. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is those things don't die just because we bury them. They just go below the surface, and they begin to operate in ways that we're not aware of. They function in our life in ways that we're not aware of, wreaking havoc in ways that we're not aware of. And I think that that's a part of why we don't seek out help for this in particular, is because we don't even know that they're functioning, because some of these reactions, I'm talking even for myself on my level of I struggle with being defensive towards my wife. And that is wired into my brain from a very early age, where when punishment was strict and harsh and painful, you develop a defense mechanism of, it's not my fault, I didn't do it, don't blame me, right? And that functions in my brain on such a subconscious level that until I can name that, I'm going to be defensive because you are criticizing me, versus me being able to say, is there something in me that's making me unnecessarily defensive? And then begin to do that work of diagnosing it. And that's just so hard to come to.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there some deeper heart work that you had to walk through in overcoming bitterness or unforgiveness toward your dad?
The honest truth is, not necessarily. I think growing up in a context, a faith context where that was a common conversation, around forgiveness. What does forgiveness mean? But when I was in college, I read a book on forgiveness. And one of the things, it was written by someone who had experienced incest, and talking about what does forgiveness mean, and this idea that forgiveness is, we kind of operate as if forgiveness is this notion of just like pretending like it never happened. Or, it means I've just got to forget that happened. And this person writing, talking about forgiveness says, forgiveness is not about pretending like it never happened. Forgiveness is about me no longer interacting with you on the basis of what you've done to me. That doesn't mean I have to trust you fully again. It doesn't mean I have to have no boundaries with you. It just means I'm no longer going to allow what you've done to continue to inflict pain on me and bitterness. And so some of it was coming to understand, really, forgiveness was as much about my mental and emotional health as it was about like letting my dad off the hook, so to speak. And so having some understanding of that was really helpful, and was really important for me in coming to a place where I could begin my own healing work. So I think I'm fortunate in that way, because I know for some people it is a lifelong struggle to find that place of forgiveness.
Yeah. So leveraging your experience to pursue healthy relationships. This is $1 million question for me. So if you're leveraging something, that means there is something that you have to use. So I thought if you had not gone through what you went through, there seems to be a strength that you have now and that you possess now that you would not have had.
Right.
Had you not gone through this.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Dang. So you're stronger now having gone through what you went through.
Yeah. And I think,
or more equipped in life. I mean, I don't know if strength, I don't know the best, label for it, but you're better off. It seems
the way that I put it is, it's not as though I'm better at relationships than people who didn't have this. I'm not saying like, man, because I went through this, I am now better at relationships than other people who didn't experience this. What I'm wanting to communicate is, when we experienced what we experienced as children, there were certain coping mechanisms that we developed to survive that environment. And those coping mechanisms served a good purpose. They helped to protect us mentally and emotionally, even physically. And so this idea of baggage is really when we carry those coping mechanisms into relationships that don't need them. That's where they begin to cause havoc in our relationships. And so the work that we've got to do is figure out, how do I keep from allowing the negative parts of those coping mechanisms from affecting my relationships, while still recognizing there was something about that coping mechanism that helped me. So, for example, growing up in the context that I grew up in, that whole idea of being able to read emotion, when I go into other relationships now, my default is to take responsibility for everyone's emotions. That's not healthy, because now I need to fix your emotions. And when you come to me as, a spouse or a friend and are telling me kind of how you're feeling, you get frustrated with me because I try to fix it for you. I try to tell you how to make it better. And so how do I disarm that while saying, I still have this ability to read your emotions, to understand your emotions, and I can use that for the good of my relationship now. And so that's what I mean by good baggage. Is it's not that I went through this and therefore I'm automatically better at relationships, but there's some things that it put in me that I've got to learn how to leverage. And if I can, it actually will help me be really good at relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. It's when people talk about books that they wrote, sometimes they'll say, it's not like a step-by-step or handbook, but you actually, reading, it sounds like you would say this is actually a pretty practical step-by-step as far as, hey, if you've gone through what I've gone through and some sort of dysfunction, here's my experience, and I believe that it could help you. Am I
That's exactly
reading
right.
it correctly here?
Yeah, as I read books around this, there was a lot that helped me understand what I experienced. They helped me understand why I am the way I am now, and then they helped me think through how do I heal? How do I begin to experience healing from that, begin to disarm some of the impact? What I didn't see was that exploration into, hey, there's actually some things that this put in you that if you can learn how to leverage, it will actually benefit you. So another example would be, that whole idea of us going to see a marriage counselor from early in our marriage comes from the place of, I know what I saw in my childhood. I know the relationships that I saw there. And I want my relationships to go differently than that. And I think for many of us who grew up in these contexts, it gave us this passion to pursue healthy relationships at all costs, because we saw what it looked like when somebody allowed their pride to keep them from getting help. When they needed the help for mental health issues or for an addiction or for abuse or whatever it was, when pride got in the way, we saw the cost of that. And so we would say, yeah, it's a blow to my ego, but I would rather have healthy, satisfying relationships than just preserve my ego. And so that is another one of those things that it just puts in us for the good of our relationships.
Yeah. What excites me too about your work is I grew up in a lot of, I would say, very unhealthy religious environments where I think that the approach would have been in some of my context of, oh, you went through hard stuff. Well, God can heal that, and that's a beautiful thing, and I do believe that there is truth to that. But how I would internalize that, and how I think I was being taught this too, was so just pray and believe, and God will heal you. And it's like, well, you can also be a part of the process.
That's right.
You can actually apply scripture. You can learn mental health. You can talk to a therapist. You can read a book like this. Like this is something that you can actually be in some sort of metaphorical driver's seat and be in the process actively.
Yeah. You're exactly right. I think that's a part of what set us back in this work too, is this idea, well, if I come to know Jesus, then Jesus will heal me of this. And when that doesn't happen, we find ourselves disillusioned with God. Like, God, why didn't you heal me? Or we leave with immense shame and guilt because we're like, did I not believe enough?
Yeah.
Did I not pray the right way? And, kind of going back to what you said about the ways that this actually has made me stronger, I think a part of the reason that God doesn't always just automatically heal us is because when that process is slower, there's actually things God wants us to learn in that process. So, for example, if God have just removed the impact of my childhood on me, I never would have gone through the journey to say, okay, how does this actually help me in relationships? What have I learned about myself? What have I learned about marriage that I can teach my congregation about their relationships? And so I think, as frustrating as it can be that we just don't experience that immediate healing, a part of that is because our healing is more than just about our healing. It's about what we can learn through the process. And that process sometimes takes time.
Yeah. You you mentioned, going through the depression. Just a quick thing about me. I went through a full-fledged mental health crisis in 2019, and just some of the experiences with that and some other things. It's crazy. It's like, because I've been a pastor since 2008, and I look back on my last 5 years, and I'm like, how did I pastor anyone of any good quality pastoring having not gone through the things that Lord Jesus, please have grace for these people that I pastored all these years.
Yes.
Because I kind of look back on that version of Joey and I'm like, I didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I do believe that God obviously can use a pastor's heart regardless of what I've learned and what I haven't learned. But man, I would imagine you're sitting here on the other side of this journey like, gosh, I am so much more able to help and pastor than I was without having all of this revelation, and this personal.
A big part of that is I think it's nuanced my theology, not in like compromising ways, but in ways that help me to understand the texture of Scripture a little more, in the sense that I think we can be taught this notion, for example, of sin as, the things that we do out of, just rebellion against God, just our desire to rebel against God's desires for us. And I think what I realized even in my own journey is, yes, there are sins that we commit out of rebellion against God, just a desire to disobey and go against his leading. But there's also things that we do and sins that we commit out of the pain that others have inflicted on us. And then it's not so much about our disobedience against God, but we are reacting from a place of our own pain. And so when we just label that as you need to repent of that before we really do the work to understand where that's coming from, then A, we're going to end up frustrated. Why can't I just overcome this sin? But B, we'll continue to live that out in different ways. Maybe it's going to look a little bit differently, but we've never dealt with the root of it. And so seeing the notion of salvation as more than just what Jesus did to pay for the sin that we deserve to be punished for, but also the notion of Jesus as the great physician who through salvation we are healed. And just that notion in the New Testament, when it speaks of somebody being saved, that word is the same word that we see when it speaks of somebody being healed. That is a healing process. And so to be able to speak of the gospel also as a message, not just about rescue, but also a message about our healing, and just how that has helped people also to experience God in a new way has been really powerful. But,
and just the ability to differentiate between those general categories of sin gives us the ability to have so much more empathy, because we move away from like, you did this, that means you're bad. And even for myself, it's like being able to, with some of the toxic religious stuff I was brought up with, being able to look at my errors as, that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It means like, we have a therapist / pastor that, basically one of his jobs here at Seacoast is to look out for the mental health of the rest of us. And, something that he has said for so long, and it just resonates, is that everybody's doing the best they can with what they have. And sometimes that pisses me off because I want to be able to be mad at somebody for doing stuff. But it's like, man, that's the most gracious posture. It sounds more like Jesus than anything. Is like, man, we're all doing the best we can, and you have no idea what sort of shoes people have walked in and why they're acting the way that they're acting. And it's just such empathy that we can have now. But hey, let's do talk about some scripture though, because obviously scripture references and things that you've learned in the Bible has been a part of your journey too. What are a couple of verses that really ring true in this journey?
One of the stories that has been really powerful for me is the story of David and Goliath, but not in the way that you might expect. Typically we think of like David's bravery and those kinds of things. The part that's been so inspiring for me is I began to realize at some point during this that a big part of what I was finding a obstacle to ministry was I felt this need to do what I saw all the successful pastors around me doing, and to be like them and to preach like them. And I realized that at some point I was starting to feel this distance between who I was and who I felt this pressure to be. And in an environment like the one that I grew up in, so much of who I was trying to be who I needed to be in order to keep my father happy, to, make things okay between my parents as best I could. And that's really what codependency comes from is a loss of self, that you don't really know who you are because of who you had to be for somebody else. And again, realizing I have been so caught up in who I think my congregation wants me to be, that I now feel this distance between who I am and who I think they want me to be. So I read the story of David and Goliath, and you see David put on Saul's armor, and David knows that this armor doesn't fit. It's not him. He's not used to it. We know Saul was a pretty large guy, so most likely it didn't fit David. And so David, unlike me, has the ability to say, this doesn't fit me. This is not how I fight my battles. Where I would have said, well, this doesn't fit me, but who am I to go to all these guys who have been fighting wars and say, I know you guys use this armor, but I'm not going to use it. It's just not how you do it, right?
Right.
And so seeing David take off the armor to know this is how I fight my battles. And not even only that, but also my trust isn't ultimately in my armor anyway. It's in the Lord of armies. That's where my trust is. Gave me the freedom to say, okay, let me take off my armor, the protective shells that I've put around myself, and say, who am I as a pastor? Who has God created me, and how has he created me to pastor? Because the success of our church does not depend on my ability to wear the right armor. It's going to depend on God and his action. And so for me, coming to a place of being able to say, let me take off the things that I think are helping me, but are really inhibiting me. I mean, the fact of the matter is, David, if he would have worn that armor, most likely would have been killed by Goliath, right? Like, it was going to work against him. And so what is the armor that I'm wearing that I think's protecting me, but it's really working against me? That's one of those stories that's been really powerful and helpful for me. And then another one is in Proverbs, where it talks about, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. And I think we think of that oftentimes in terms of decisions we make or leadership, but it's true for our marriages and for our relationships that for lack of counsel, this plan we have, I say this at every wedding I do, this plan we have to be together till death do us part will fail, but with many advisors, it will succeed. That this idea that we can bring people around us to help us walk this road of healthy relationships together. I mean, Solomon, thought to be the wisest man of all time, this is his words, many advisors, you will succeed. And who are we to think we don't need that in our lives as well?
Yeah, that's awesome, man. All of this is just so awesome. I have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
One would be, knowing what you know about how effectual your upbringing was and the time that you spent at home and the sorts of things that you absorbed as a kid, does it relieve you currently as a father, where you're like, man, I'm super glad that my kids aren't going to have the same baggage that I had to work through? Or does it make you a little bit OCD in a way of, oh shoot, I hope I'm doing the right thing? Because I if I'm not careful, I would go for the latter and be like, oh shoot, I hope I don't mess my kids up. Like, where are you at with your kids? Because man, we all know the kids are the biggest blessing and the biggest curse. We just never knew that we could love humans at such a depth. I was just texting back and forth with a friend of mine, just like, I cannot believe how much I love these kids, and it hurts so bad to see them hurt, Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think when I first started doing a lot of this work, you're like, man, our children are so fragile. Like, there's so many things that we can do unintentionally to impact our children. Even just, giving them praise all the time because they get good grades leads them to think, well, my value is in my performance, and so that can be terrifying. And it can lead to that kind of OCD and that pressure. But what I've learned, and I think that this is the grace that I'll extend to everybody, is what was so helpful for me to learn is there is the things that we do unintentionally, the ways that we have outbursts at our children or react to our children in ways that, man, later we're like, gosh, I messed that up. That yes, they can be destructive for them. But what is also really powerful for our children is when we teach them how to repair a relationship. And so when we go to them and we are able to name, hey, I responded to you in a really harsh way, and I think you may have taken that as you did something really wrong. But I want you to know that that was more about, I had a really stressful day today and I took that out on you. And is this a behavior that we do in the future? No, this is something that we want you to do differently, but I want you to know my response was not okay. And for them to experience that not only helps them to know, okay, it's not because I'm bad that they responded that way. It's because of kind of where they're coming from. I can still learn and not do that, but it teaches them how to go into their own relationships then and to be able to repair them. And so I want, the people that are listening to know that as much as kind of what I went through shaped me, I also know that there are times that if my dad would have come to me and said, you know what, I really messed up there. I should not have responded to you that way. That wasn't about you. That was about me. That would have been a game changer.
Game changer. That's the exact words that came to my mind as game changer.
Yeah. And so, it does make us more aware of the things that we do and the impact they can have, but it also teaches us how do we do the repair work, which is huge as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, does the even on this side of so much healing, do you still find yourself in times where some of that dysfunction sneaks up and you're like, oh, wow, I'm actually having to address this still?
Yeah. And that's kind of what I mean when I talk about how these things function on such a subconscious level. We're talking about things that formed before we have memory of
we can't even wrap our mind around that.
Right.
We don't even know what that's like. Yeah.
And it was, it's the fight or flight or freeze kind of mechanisms where this is how we responded to protect ourselves. And it had to function before we could even think, how do I react? And so that's why I think this is more than just like praying and God heals these things. We actually have to disarm some of those things. And so a big part of my work is being able to reflect on my reactions to people and say, okay, where did that come from? And I'm not going to do this perfectly, but next time, how do I respond differently? There's times now where I catch myself in the middle of responding a way that I know is not healthy and having to say, okay, where's this coming from? Let me back up. So it really is, it's a lifelong journey. But what I tell people is, even if you're just beginning now, your relationships will be so much healthier than if you never started this work. And so even if you're just starting this work, it's crucial work to start doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, I want to let, no offense to Christine Kane, her words were awesome, but I want to let Lisa Whittle wrap I love what she said about this book. She says, no one outmaneuvers the complexities of their childhood, but good baggage provides clarity and hope in its aftermath. Ike Miller has masterfully addressed our real questions, offered powerful perspectives, and given us tools to move forward. This book is so critical for pastors and leaders. It should be their next read and on their recommended resource list. It's on mine. That's pretty powerful stuff, man. Congrats.
Thank you.
On just, it sounds like a great work. I can't wait to read it. Your people never sent me a book, by the way.
We'll get that to you. We'll get that to you.
I will buy one. Man, thank you so much for your time. I think that, I think just hearing this conversation is going to be just very soothing for people who are like, man, this guy gets me, and I recommend it. Is Amazon the best route to take?
Yep. Amazon's probably the easiest way to do it. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, Joey, thanks so much for having me. I've super enjoyed this conversation.
You've been listening to the Things You Won't Hear on Sunday Seacoast podcast. In the show notes, you'll see a link to our Facebook group page. Also, we'd love for you to consider subscribing so you get these episodes downloaded right when they come out. Thanks so much for listening.